Continuing with Sumerian grammar, the final person prefix within the verbal chain, we're talking about the indirect object and the oblique object. So first of all, in English, what is the indirect object and the oblique object? So first of all, the indirect object is the recipient or the thing that is affected by the direct object. So in English, it's fairly straightforward and simple. Enki gave wisdom to Enmakar. Enki, the subject. Enki gave, transitive verb. What did Enki give? Wisdom. Wisdom being the direct object, the immediate recipient of the action of the verb. And then what did he give it to? He gave Enmakar the wisdom. Enmakar being the indirect object, the recipient of the direct object. This is quite an easy example to understand though, but it's not always directly flowing like that, you know. So this is like Enki gave wisdom to Enmakar. It flows, the arrow flows nicely through, but it doesn't always act that way. For instance, in she brought him a present, him is the indirect object here. But if you always question the verb, you can't go wrong. So she bought, what did she buy? She bought a present for him. So him is the indirect object, a present is the direct object, she is the subject, and bought is the verb, obviously. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because Sumerian is very much like this. It rarely flows directly through. So in the case of Enki gave wisdom to Enmakar, Enmakara, Enkike, Nyashtug, Munanshum. So in Sumerian, the indirect object can be expressed as a noun phrase, as a prefix in the verbal chain, or it can be in both at the same time, as it is here. So this would literally translate as, to Enmakar, by Enki, wisdom to him he gave. So this sentence starts off with the indirect object, Enmakara. Enmakar is the indirect object, and our first clue to that being the indirect object is it being marked in the dative case for the noun phrase, Ra. The next line says Enkike. This is a subject. We know this is a subject because it's marked in the ergative case. It's marked with the ergative case marker. The ergative, as I've said in many videos, marks the subject of a transitive verb. So now with the ergative case on Enki and the dative case on Enmakar, we know that Enki is doing something to Enmakar and not Enmakar doing something to Enki. Next line is Nyashtug. This simply means wisdom, and this is the direct object. Now we're just left with the verbal chain, Munanshum. So let's just get mu out of the way quickly. So mu is the vented prefix, and most grammars will tell you that it donates emotion towards the speaker. So in my opinion, it's one of those things that gets lost in translation when converted to English. It holds meaning, but it doesn't directly translate to English. But it's frequently used with transitive verbs when the transitive verb is referring to an animate object, either, you know, human or a god. But we don't have a function like that in English, so we'll just ignore it. All right, now, so na. This is cross-referencing the dative and the indirect object of the nominal phrase, of the noun phrase. It's in the third person, and it's cross-referencing Enmakar, saying to him. Here are some other forms of the dative case as the indirect object. So an, this is the final person prefix in the third person. If you see an N within the verbal chain, N always represents the third person. The final person prefix gets its name because it's the last constituent part that appears before the verbal root. It can appear as the transitive subject, the oblique object, or the direct object. And in this context, it's appearing as and cross-referencing the transitive subject, and we'll translate it as he. And finally, shum is the verbal root, meaning to give. It's in the past tense, so gave. Okay, I'm going to end it there. Let's not overload the information. So in part 3 of this series, I'll talk about the oblique object within the Sumerian context and more about the final person prefix.